Okay, today we're going to have a little Bible lesson and history lesson, and actually a little lesson about baking from the kitchen right here. It has to do with these little pastries that I'm going to show you here. What are these guys about? We're about to find out. Okay, these little pastries, about the end of February every year, the Jews have a celebration they call Purim. And what that is about is a biblical story. It has to do with anti-Semitism. And basically what happened was the Jews about 460 years or so BC, there's a gal by the name of Esther. Esther was a Jew, and she's living in a town called Susa. Susa was in what today would be called Iran, not too far from the Euphrates River, but in the hill country east of the river. And there was a guy there that served under the king. His name was Haman. Now Haman had his heritage, and his descendants had a long history of animosity towards the Jews for a good reason. If you go back into the Bible, into 1 Samuel chapter 15, you'll read a story about how God told the king of Israel to go wipe out the Agagites, or that was their king's name. It was actually the Amalekites was the name of the tribe or the kingdom. The king's name was Agag. So his descendants came to be known as Agagites. Well, this guy Haman, fast forward a few hundred years, because the original problem that we see, the battle that happened in 1 Samuel 15, was somewhere around 1100 years BC. So fast forward to about 460 BC, several hundred years, obviously, and that animosity and that hatred for the Jews still existed. Now, a lot of the Agagites had been killed by the Jews, but there was obviously quite a few of them that had escaped, and one of them happened to be, 100 years later, descendant. This guy named Haman was serving under the king in Susa, okay, in a kingdom called Elam. It would be, like I said earlier, modern Iran. Well, what came about was Haman was able to drum up this idea that they should kill all the Jews. And he tried to talk the king into it, and the king thought, might be a good idea. And so he convinced him to do that. Well, Esther, to make a long story short, you need to read the book of Esther to get the whole story, but she had an uncle named Mordecai. And Mordecai had some history of positive things with the previous administration. He had ratted out some guys that were trying to kill the king, and the present king didn't seem to know much about that, but somebody brought it to his attention, and Esther ends up becoming the queen. The king wasn't so satisfied with the present gal who was king, so ends up through a long series of things, Esther becomes queen. Well, he didn't know that she was a Jew. And so when Haman trumped up this idea to have the Jews all killed, she interceded with the coaching of her uncle Mordecai, and basically turned everything around. And as it turns out, Haman ended up hanging on the gallows along with a lot of his family. So out of that, the Jews were vindicated. And sometimes you'll see in various English translations two different names for this king. Sometimes you'll see Artaxerxes or Xerxes. Sometimes it's Ahasuerus. And what's behind that is different translations depending on how literal they want to translate it. Sometimes it's based off the Latin, sometimes it's based off the Greek. And so that's why you see different words used for these different characters. So it's really not a problem in translation. It just depends on whether they have a Greek or a Latin bias when they translated it. So when Haman is killed and a series of things that happen, but Mordecai is elevated politically under the king, and the Jews are vindicated, and they basically take out vengeance on their enemies. Okay, and they have a celebration which has turned out to be what we call Purim, and they celebrate this every year. And a lot of people don't understand really a lot about the history. It's actually pretty gruesome, a pretty gruesome history. And but even in the synagogue, oftentimes, whenever Haman's name is read in the synagogue, the Jews will make a bunch of racket, or they'll start yelling, or they'll have toys that they spin around and make a bunch of racket, or they ring bells and clap their hands and different things. And then eventually they have a feast where they eat these little pastries, these Hamantaschen. What they are is Haman's ears. And what that's about is whenever somebody was condemned to die on the gallows back in those days, they would first cut their ears off, because apparently these folks wouldn't listen to reason. So as an example for their stubbornness, they would cut their ears off before they actually killed them. So these are symbolic of Haman's ears. Now, sometimes stories like Haman's ears are not very politically correct for obvious reasons. And so you notice the shape of these things. They're kind of like a triangle. And does that kind of remind you of the shape of some of the hats that you've seen on soldiers during the War of Independence in America, early American soldiers as well as the British soldiers, the way they had the triangular hats? Well, to be politically correct, modern Jews often call these Haman's hats. But let me tell you, Haman didn't wear a hat like this in the Middle East. The Western style hat with a brim around it, like this one here, okay, to shade you from the sun. Now, if you're a soldier and you're carrying a weapon over your shoulder like this, the brim oftentimes gets in the way. And if you notice, like Australian soldiers, oftentimes they have the brim peeled up on one side and snapped to the side. That would be the side that they carry, the shoulder that they carry their weapon on. Okay, left or right, depending on whether you're left-handed or right-handed. Well, there was a similar problem with American early soldiers in America during the Revolution. They would fold it up on the back because often they had a backpack, and of course the brim of their hat would be in the way. Their backpack would try to knock their hat off. Or they carried muskets, and the muskets were big guns. They had something like this. This is actually a shotgun, but they had a big barrel, longer than this, and the barrel obviously would be, wearing a hat like this would be a problem. So they would fold it up on three sides until they needed a visor, then they could fold it back down. Okay, so political correctness, sometimes it's a problem for us trying to understand history. So eating pastries can have historical significance. They can be an illustration of something that happened. In this case, the Feast of Purim. Now there's another interesting thing that a lot of Americans are not aware of. We eat a pastry called a croissant. It's shaped like a crescent, right? Well, the crescent is a Muslim symbol, and where that pastry comes from, there's a legend that goes back to about 1683, somewhere thereabouts, when Vienna was under siege by the Ottoman Empire, the Muslims, okay? And the way the story goes, the wall around the city, the Muslims were trying to dig under it and tear it down with cannon fire and everything else. And there just happened to be a baker that was, of course, if you have a bakery, you're up really bright and early every morning, getting everything ready to go, getting things cooked, and getting the yeast to raise the dough and everything. And this baker just happened to hear some commotion, which eventually they discovered was the Muslims were trying to dig under the wall. And he brought it to the attention of the local authorities, and they stopped the Muslims from their invasion. That was the end of it. Okay, so the Muslims are not too proud of that to this day, but out of that came the tradition of eating croissants. So every time you eat a croissant, you should be reminded of the history that at the walls of Vienna, that put an end to the invasion of the Muslim Empire, the Ottomans.